right. Well, if it's your first time with us, we're glad you're here. And you picked a great week to be with us because we're kicking off a brand new series. We like to take our messages, like the teaching during this part of the service, and we group them together under a common theme or idea. We call that a series. And today we're starting a brand new one called Stories. Stories. Now, I don't need to tell you this, but there is something amazing about the way that the human mind processes stories, right? You ever thought about that? You know, if I were to just give you information for 2 hours straight, it'd be pretty hard to comprehend. But if you were to sit through a movie for 2 hours, 2.5 hours maybe, chances are after that movie, or maybe even like a week after that movie, you probably could tell me what that movie was about, because there's something about stories that stick in the mind. They stay with us. And so it's no surprise that Jesus taught in stories. He called those stories, or we call those stories, parables. Now, the great thing about these parables is they're not just stories with a moral. They're not just ethical stories, though they do have morals and ethics. They teach us what life looks like in what Jesus would call the kingdom of God, or to put it in regular terms, like what life looks like living as if God is king and gets to call the shots. And there are some things about that way of living that are upside down and unexpected and inside out. And Jesus uses these stories to really get people thinking. And what's amazing about the stories is that they have this ability to connect deeply with people who are super devout and also people who are seriously in doubt, like people who are faithful, right? Like who love church and are devoted in their faith, and people that are like, I'm not sure. His audience was totally diverse, and he just challenged them to have ears to hear. Like, be open-minded, consider this stuff, and it had this way of shaping and impacting literally the world for the next 2,000 years. And so he tells stories, and we're going to spend the next couple weeks talking about some of these stories. So, tell you a little story, all right? This past week, I had the chance to go to Virginia, which is where my wife is from, and I like to drive through the night because I don't like traffic. So I get on the road at like 3 a.m. and I take off, and I'm an efficient driver, right? I'm not drive crazy fast, but I like to get to where I'm going. It kind of becomes a game for me. I want to see how quickly I can do it because I've done the trip so many times. And so I start driving, and on the road, every once in a while, especially on this one road in Virginia, it's called 29, right? There's two lanes. There's the right lane and there's the left lane, right? In the right lane, you can go as slow as you want because that's what the right lane is for. But then there's the left lane. And the left lane is for passing or driving at an efficient speed, right? So sometimes I'm driving and I'll, get into the left lane, and every once in a while you see someone going really slow in the left lane, and I can deal with that, right? But what I can't deal with, what just really gets under my skin, is when you have someone in the left lane who's driving slow, who is also driving the same exact speed as the person in the right lane, and then the two of them form this impenetrable wall for me and everyone for the last 120 miles, because there's no getting around them, right? And it is like, in those situations, I would consider these people to be, or at least what they're doing, to be problematic, right? It creates a problem. They stand in the way of me going my way. They stand in the way of things going my way. Or maybe, there's like the left turn right here on Long Island. You need to take a road trip to feel this way. In Long Island, the great thing about Long Island is that when you want to make a left at a light, you have the right to the center of the intersection. So you can pull right up. And even if the light turns yellow, you can still at least get one car through that round, But every once in a while, you get someone who maybe just doesn't know, right? And then I'm sitting back there, and I'm not going to beep, but I'll give them the look in the rearview mirror, depending on how far I am from the church property, right? Like, come on. They stand in the way, just kidding. They stand in the way of things going my way, right? And maybe you have traffic situations like that, but maybe they're more serious. Maybe there are people in your life that you consider problematic, or things that they're doing that's problematic. Like there's a way you want certain things to go, and they're in the way. Their way of thinking, their way of being, their way of doing is in your way. Maybe it's work, and if they would just stop, move over, you could go your way. Maybe it's home. Maybe there's an issue with someone you're close with, and they've got a way, and it's in the way of things going your way. And it's a problem. And they're the problem. They're the problem. Right? Or maybe there's a certain way, 'tis the season, that you'd like the country to be. And there's a certain group of people that are in the way of things going your way. And they're the problem. They're the problem. People can, for us, become problematic or do things that are problematic. But thankfully, fortunately for us, Jesus had a lot to say about our interactions with problematic people. He talked about it in a lot of different ways and a lot of different stories. And so I want to share with you a story that he told about somebody who was problematic in society. But I'm going to change the details a little bit just for the sake of changing the details, okay? So there's these cousins, Ron and Tim. And Ron is, he's the kind of guy that you want your kids to be just like. He's super devoted to God. He doesn't just do the thing he's supposed to do. He goes above and beyond. Like he goes the extra mile. He goes a little further than he needs to. He is well respected. He's influential. And his life is a picture of his devotion to God. He has given so much and done so much to support his community of faith, and for that, he is deeply admired, and respected in his community. And Ron grew up knowing Tim, his cousin, but at a certain point, they went in a different direction. And Tim's life looks totally different than Ron's. They're like polar opposites. Tim, instead of being devoted to his faith, he's lived a life in rebellion. He's not done even the bare minimum. He's not the guy that your kids look up to. He's the one you want your kids to avoid. He's the problematic person in society. The way that he lived was actually hindering the people who were devoted to God from expressing their worship. Like he was in the way. And it's because of one decision after the next. He profited off of the vulnerability of other people. He was part of a shady operation, a government agenda that the religious community did not like, and he lived his life anti-God and people that trust in God. Well, one day on Christmas Eve, the two of them end up in church together, and Ron takes a moment to pray, and he offers God a prayer of gratitude. He stops and thinks about his life. He thinks about the choices that he made. He thinks about the habits he developed. He thinks about the way that he expresses his devotion to God. And he thanks God for what his life has become. And he looks over at Tim, and he remembers the choices that Tim made. Like where Tim's way of life has led, and all that it's turned into for Tim. And he recognizes that he could have been like Tim. And so he prays and he says, God, thank you that I'm not doing what everybody else is doing. That I'm not like everyone else, and my life could have been like Tim's, and it's not. And then Tim takes a moment to pray, and he's uncomfortable. He doesn't like to be where he is. But he prays because that's where he is. And immediately he's aware, like thinking about God and who God is, he's aware of just how short he has fallen. He feels small. And it hits him in an emotional way. And he asks God for what he doesn't deserve, right? This guy who has been taking from the religious community has the audacity to step into this situation and ask God to give to him. And he says, God, I'm imperfect, I'm broken, and so if there's gonna be anything between me and you, it's gotta be a free gift. It's gotta be mercy, compassion. And so would you feel for me? That's the end. It's the end of the story. Jesus tells that story to a crowd, the story of Ron and Tim. And he says, I tell you the truth, one of those guys went home right with God, and one of them didn't. One of them had done well in the eyes of God, and one of them was all wrong. And it was Tim who had done well. It was Tim who went home justified that day, not Ron. And if you're like, what? Like, it doesn't, really? If it doesn't compute, if it's a little confusing, that was the exact feeling that the people in that crowd would have felt. Like, what in the world is he talking about? How can that be? This is how Jesus told the story, and maybe you're familiar with this version. They're not actually cousins, but they grew up together in the same community. Jesus says 2 men went up to the temple to pray. It wasn't a church, it was a temple, but that was their place of religious expression. One of them was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. Now, the reason I didn't tell you this is because if you're familiar with the New Testament, you hear Pharisee, and you probably think bad guy. But if you lived during the time the New Testament was written, you didn't think bad guy. You thought role model, the guy who's doing it all right, going above and beyond. I want to grow up and be like him. Like if you were a Pharisee, it was because you were the best of the best in every one of your religious classes, and now you are the example to the religious community. These people were influential and respected, and the other was a tax collector. The tax collector was not just a bad guy, he was a good guy that became a bad guy. He was a traitor. The people in that culture at that time, they were under the oppression, under the power of the Roman Empire. And so they struggled to be able to worship freely. They were under the thumb of Rome. And a tax collector was a Jewish person who was part of that community, but was like, you know what, I can make a lot more money working for Rome. So they would leave their community and go work for Rome and take advantage of the people in their community. They would get rich by overcharging people what they owed in taxes. And so they were absolutely hated in this community. In fact, there's this book, it's called the Mishnah. It was another authoritative writing for the ancient Jewish people. There are rules in that book that are specific to how you can treat tax collectors. Like they were allowed, and they believed that God was cool with them lying to tax collectors because they were tax collectors. They don't even deserve to hear the truth. Like you could mistreat these people in a special way because they were a special kind of hated. And this is the guy who's in there. And so the Pharisee, he stands by himself. He's not near the tax collector, but he prays. It says the Pharisee stood by the tax collector and prayed. And here's his prayer. He says, God, thank you that I'm not like other people. Now you and I, we might read a tone into this that isn't there. The people hearing Jesus tell this story, they're thinking, yeah, of course, this guy's not like other people. And he's thanking God. That's nice. He's expressing gratitude. Then he lists some people. He's like, robbers, I don't rob anyone. I'm not an evildoer, adulterer. And then he looks over at the tax collector over there, and he's like, he recognizes, even my life could have been like his, but it's not. I'm not like other people or even like this tax collector. Then he lists off his resume. He says, I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. That's above and beyond. You didn't have to. The ancient Jewish law did not require them to fast this much, but he took it a step further. He did a little more, and he's like, this is what my life has become. I'm not like other people. But the tax collector prays, and he's uncomfortable. We're told he stands at a distance. He won't even walk into the temple. He's not walking in, getting all comfortable. He wouldn't look up to heaven, but he beat his breast, he beat his chest, and he says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of mercy, but I used to play this game with my sister where we would grab each other's hands and twist them, and the first person to yell mercy would lose, right? That's what I think of. So it's like not inflicting pain. But mercy is a highly emotional word. It has this idea of being emotionally invested in someone who does not necessarily deserve your emotional investment. And so here this guy's asking for God to show him mercy. Look at these two people side by side. You have someone whose whole life is dedicated to doing the right thing. It's a picture of religious devotion. He has given so much of himself to the prosperity of the community, and his prayer is one of gratitude. He's like, thanks. And then you have someone else who is a mess. He's done it all wrong. He's treated people horribly. He has taken from people, not given, taken. And his prayer is, God, give me more. Like he's asking, he's not expressing gratitude. He's like, give me what I don't deserve. You'd be sitting there and thinking like the gall, like the guts that this guy has. In their law, by the way, they lived, when they did something wrong or took money from someone, they were required to pay it back and then some. But the idea with the tax collector was that they had taken so much, there's no possible way they could ever pay it back. So these people were just seen as hopeless. And Jesus says, after all this, he's like, I tell you the truth. Ready? Listen. This man, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, the tax collector, rather than the religious person, went home justified before God. He went home, I know he did, there. He went home justified before God. So, like, thinking about this, right, there's some confusion there. It's like, what's going on? Okay, what is so wrong about what the guy who was doing all right, what was so wrong about that seemed to discredit all of his good? And what was so right about the guy who was so wrong that seemed to overshadow all the bad stuff he was doing? Like, what's going on there? Well, fortunately for us, Luke, who's writing this down, tells us why Jesus told this story. He says, this story was told to some who were confident of their own righteousness, and they looked down on everyone else. To those people, it says, Jesus told this parable. Now, this phrase here is translated in different ways based on the Bible version that you're used to reading. But the idea here is the confidence here. It has this idea of being fully convinced. Those who are fully convinced or trusting in or are resting in, like they're just sure of their own righteousness. Now, we don't typically use that word, but it has this idea of measuring up, of being in the right. They're totally settled with where they are. They measure up, and they're in the right. With what they do, with how they view things, with how they see the world, with their resume, they're good. And this is the crowd that Jesus is speaking to. And he says, and along with that, they look down on everyone else. Right? Think about that. If you're totally sure that you measure up, and there's someone who's doing something different than you, well, then they're down. Right? If you're totally convinced that you're in the right and you meet someone who's doing something different or who you're not like the Pharisee says, well, if you're in the right, then they're in the wrong. And while we might not say we look down on them, the idea in the language here is that we give less value to their way of thinking or their understanding or their viewpoint. We could say, with this parable, one of the main points that Jesus is pushing here is that God looks down on people looking down on people. He looks down on this game of measuring up and of being in the right. He looks down on people, looking down on people. And you know, like for me, it's not so easy to recognize when I'm looking down on someone. But if you look at the words in the prayer, there's something here that I think could be like a little indicator for us. This is the words of the prayer of that religious person. He says, God, thank you that I'm not like them. Not like this tax collector. God, I'm not like them. Like, there's your indicator. If I'm confident I measure up and I'm not like you, well then you don't. If I'm confident that I'm in the right and I'm not like you, well then you're in the wrong. If we go back to that idea of there being a problem, right, in problematic situations with problematic people, if I'm in the right and I measure up and there's a problem between us and God, I'm not like them, then they are the problem. They are the problem. And this is where we begin to look down on people, because I am totally sure of myself, totally sure of my views, totally sure of my opinions, because I'm in the right. I'm part of the right group, in the right club, and we're not like each other. Some translations take this phrase contempt, looking down, and they translate it contempt. Contempt. It's when you give little value or weight or worth to the thoughts and ideas of others. You know, it's interesting if you look at this in light of the big picture. In a marriage, marriage experts would say that the sign that a marriage is about to fall apart is when the two people begin to see each other with contempt. When we're not like each other, and your feelings, your thoughts, your views, they're small to me. I don't even value them anymore. They don't hold any weight. Your thoughts and words and feelings don't hold weight, and it's because we're not like each other anymore. And if you think about, remember, this whole thing is about what it looks like to live with God as king, life in the kingdom of God. If there's any hope for unity, and not uniformity, but unity, like community, where people are living in harmony, then there needs to be this level ground. If you look at the prayer of the tax collector, what he got right, what's the answer here? It's in his prayer. He says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Like, who's in this prayer? It's him and it's God. And how does he see himself? As a sinner, like someone that literally means who falls short. In other words, the prayer of one was, God, I'm not like them. But the prayer of this guy was, God, I'm not like you. His point of reference changes everything. And all of a sudden, the game of like measuring up, it seems insignificant. When you recognize the difference between a God who is good in every way and unselfish in every way and loving in every way, who gave everything for people like you and I. And we see ourselves in light of that, we're like, well, I am so far from that. And all of a sudden, the guy that I'm measuring myself up against, we don't seem so different. I'm a lot more like him than I may have realized before. It's like if you got a guy who's 6'5", right? And then a guy who's 5'6", woo. Right? There's a big difference there. And the guy who's 6'5" can look down on the guy who's 5'6", because we're playing that game, right? But the second you put someone at the top of the Empire State Building, both of them look like ants, right? If you've ever been up there, look down and notice how tall everybody is. You're not going to be able to tell. And that's this guy's speaking from God's viewpoint. It's like, look, we're all falling short. Fine, you want to like do this? Okay, I'm a little better. I fast twice a week. I have never fasted. Like, there's all this, fine, but in the grand scheme of things, when God enters that equation, man, we are so much more alike than we are different. And if we're talking from a theological standpoint, right? This is important. If we're talking about having a relationship with God, right? The idea is none of us are going to like jump and get to the top of the Empire State Building, right? So if it's going to happen, if there's going to be a meaningful connection there, it's going to be a gift. And that's why we talk about grace and God being like, you can't earn this because you'll never make it on your own. Right? And so it's a gift for the guy who's 5'6" and a gift for the guy who's 6'5". It's a level playing field. The point here is not to live with shame. It's not to beat yourself up. The point here is that God in his goodness has leveled the playing field, and we are more like each other than we might realize. And you know what? When my viewpoint, maybe not my prayer, but when my viewpoint from a practical standpoint is when I've got an issue, I've got a problem, and I'm keeping in mind, like, there's a third party here. God is involved. If my prayer is, God, I'm not like you, then I go into the conflict, the problematic situation, the situation with the person that there's an issue with, recognizing that there's some similarities, and you know what? I may be the problem. I may be the problem. If you want to transform a relationship or a conflict in a relationship, go into that conflict with the idea, or at least the posture, that there's a problem here and I may be that problem. I may be that problem. You know, I think, and this is just my opinion, I think as people in the church, I think the church struggles with the idea that we may be wrong about things, that we may be the problem. There's this like little game that I play with Allie, and I'm not suggesting this because it's not really like a kind game to play, but sometimes we'll be going back and forth we'll be arguing about something that doesn't matter, like an athlete or a person or whatever, and we'll have a different viewpoint on it. And finally I'll look at her and I'll just be like, you know what, you can think that, I forgive you. And she'll look at me, she'll be like, I didn't ask for forgiveness. I'm like, oh, that's the great thing about forgiveness. I'll forgive you, you don't even have to ask for it. And she's like, right? And it gets her frustrated, and don't do that. But in a way, like, sometimes the church will do this, where we'll come up against someone who is different from us, right? Who thinks different, believes different, does different. And before, like, we're more willing to try to love or to try to forgive them than to even consider that they may be right. And so what if we were the kind of people that had the posture that I may be the problem here? There's a guy, his name's G.K. Chesterton. There's a story, I actually don't know if this story is true. It might just be a legend that's been passed on. But apparently there's a newspaper that sent out this article that said, what's wrong with the world? And they invited everyone to write in. And people wrote in all these different responses. And this guy, he's a pastor, a person of faith. He wrote in, "Dear sir, I am. Yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." Like, totally aware that as human beings, we are naturally selfish and flawed and broken, and in any given situation, we may be the problem. People who are right with God, according to Jesus, are those who are people who are willing to admit that they're wrong with people. And so what if that was the posture of the church? Like, yeah, they've got some beliefs, but they're so open to my ideas. Like, it's like they genuinely listen and want to know the truth. They don't come at me with a gavel or a hammer, like ready to judge and decide that they're fully convinced that they measure up and they're in the right. But there's a curiosity about them. You know, when you see someone that you feel like you're like, or you look up to, or you respect, and they do something that's totally out of character, you don't look at them with contempt. You look at them with curiosity. You're like, oh, why would they do that? Because I'm like them, right? We're on level ground, and so what would cause them to arrive at that conclusion or do that thing? But it starts with the humility of recognizing that we may be imperfect in our understanding. I had a conversation with someone not too long ago, and something had happened, and when I heard about it, it made me angry. And I've got a little rule. I wait 24 hours after somebody does something that bothers me to talk about it, especially if I'm mad, because it just helps things settle. Well, 24 hours came and went, and I was still annoyed. And so I had to have a conversation with them, like we talked about in our Sticky Situations series. It went right to the source. And we sat down, and I've read the books, right? And I know the formula, you know, how you start with admitting maybe you're wrong and help me understand what happened here. And so I went through the things and I did the steps. And as I listened with no intention of thinking that I was wrong, I learned that I was completely in the wrong. That all of this would not have started if I wasn't doing what I was doing. And it blew my mind. It blew my mind. But it starts with recognizing we may be the problem. And so Jesus says something here. He closes this by saying, he says something, it's not a threat, it's a statement of reality, and you know this. He says, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. It's not a threat, and these words here in the original language, they're used figuratively, but they can literally mean to lift yourself up or to put yourself down. He's saying the way up is down, right? And you know this. If you've ever seen someone or respected someone who did something wrong and they were confronted and they came out and they were like, yeah, what I did was inappropriate, insensitive, out of line, unacceptable, and I'm sorry. Like the opposition just like it melts. It turns into respect. Like, thank you for recognizing the pain that you've caused. It's not like, ha, see, I told you, boom, smush. There's a tendency to lift people up who own their shortcomings. But when they put up their walls and refuse to come down, your view of them gets real small. Because those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And those who humble themselves will be exalted. I'd ask the band to come back up here. We're out of time. I remember when my daughter was born, I remember being blown away that they were going to let me leave the hospital with this newborn baby. It's like, this is too much responsibility. This thing is so fragile. And I put her in the car. And I put her in the back seat, in a car seat, and I remember for the first time being afraid to drive. Like, I was scared, totally questioning my ability because there was a baby in the back seat. You know what happened? I pulled up to a light and I had to make a left. The light was green, and I was scared. And I didn't want to make the turn because cars were coming. And I was questioning my judgment and my ability to read how fast they were moving because there was a kid in the back seat that changed things for me. Now, I'm the person that's usually behind that person in the rear view mirror. But very quickly, things can change because we're more like each other than we might realize. And there might be a person in your life right now that's problematic, but maybe they've got a kid in the back seat. And maybe, if we'll be the first to recognize we may be the problem, we'll show people what it looks like to live like Jesus knew what he was talking about. Like the way up is down.